Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and with my limited understanding of the Holly Bible, I've come to realize that angels come in two distinct flavors. Rings and wings, and last year I made some wings, so this year I figured I ought to make some rings. Of course, if I'm going to be making an ophanum, as I just now learned is their biblically accurate name, then I'm going to need to make a few eyeballs. Or perhaps more accurately, I'm going to need a few hundred eyeballs. Once I've got 100 eyes balled up, it's into the oven to bake, before popping them off the tray and setting the big one aside for later while I get to work making double the amount of eyes I have by chopping every single eyeball in half. And with that, I now have 200 blank white domes that need some color. To make my life a little easier to make it possible to handle all these blank blind eyeballs, I'll cover a little MDF sheet in painter's tape with the sticky side facing upwards so I can add all the eyeballs facing up. All I need to do now then is turn this board of white balls into an unsettlingly blue-backed eyeball wall by poking each of the eyeballs with a teeny tiny makeup sponge filled with a couple different colors of paint. I think traditionally an ophanum has blue eyes, but that's a bit boring, so I decided to add a bit of extra color by adding some red, purple, and green eyes as well. To my brown-eyed brethren, sorry, but our eyes aren't meant for heavenly bodies. By the time I finish the last iris, the first is dried, so I can go back with a teeny tiny ball stylus covered in black paint to add each of the itty bitty black pupils in the center. Otherwise, with the little balls finished, I can move on to the big central ocular orb. Given the size of this eyeball, I don't trust these shaky hands to freehand a perfect circle, so I'll paint one of my cookie cutters with some black paint, then press that onto the eyeball to make the outline that I can then paint inside with a series of blues and purples to create an appropriately angelic looking iris. Some black will make the pupil in the center, and I'll add some streaks and extra lines of black to break up the blue before adding some final bright blue towards the center. But with that, my eyeball is finished and I'm ready to make my rings. I want my ophanum to be adjustable rather than static, so I need to make the rings separately rather than sculpted out of a single form. To that end, I found a couple metal cutting rings to make the first and second sections and an empty painter's tape roll to make the final segment. These rings will form the base that I can build the actual clay rings on top of. I'll start by wrapping the metal ring in a thick flatworm of clay that reaches all the way around. I can then chop off the excess, leaving me with a couple flat sides and a thick central slab into which I can begin the inoculating process, which involves jamming a plethora of eyeballs into the surface. At this point, I'm also not sure how I'm going to be getting the three rings to connect to each other, but I thought maybe some magnets would work, so I'll press some into the ring in case I want to add them later. Then it's back to the eyeballing of the ring with as many little peepers as I can reasonably fit in place. Once that's done, I can set my ring aside, double checking its girthiness before getting on to making the second ring. This follows pretty much the same procedure with a slab of clay wrapped around the metal ring, cut and smooth so it follows the shape and thickness of the first ring, and then eyeballed until there's no room left for more eyeballs. Then it's on to the third ring, doing the exact same thing. The only difference here is that clay doesn't really stick to cardboard, so the actual inoculating process was a touch more frustrating since my ring kept slipping off the cardboard to base. Otherwise, I just added eyeballs until I either ran out of set eyeballs or I ran out of ring space. Once my rings were adequately eyed up, I decided that they needed a bit of texture, and while I'm not sure if this is biblically accurate, I decided to go with a non-committal fluffy white furry look since I like the idea of them being sort of the same texture as wings. Otherwise, once my rings have been baked, I can remove the supporting metal ring, roughen up the otherwise too smooth surface, and add a tiny bit more texture to the inside of the ring. Originally, I wanted to add eyeballs to the inside, but I wasn't sure if I could add any extra eyeballs without making the ring too thick to fit inside the other rings, so I just went with more furry wing texturing. I also ran out of eyeballs, and I really didn't want to make more. Finally, my eyes are a bit too bug-eyed for what I imagine a heavenly messenger would be looking like, so I'll give each of my eyeballs a pair of eyelids by squishing some itty-bitty wormy dealies above and below each eyeball, then blending them into the surrounding ring body. Once each eye is appropriately eyelided, I can push back the eyelid with a rounded silicone shaper to get the eyelid shape looking ship-shape before coming back with a sharper sculpting tool to add that final bit of ocular flair. Otherwise, that's my first ring finished, so I'll repeat all these steps to make the rest of my rings and a final fitting to make sure they all fit together. It's fortunate that they do, since there's no way I was going to do all that again if they didn't. Now, because I baked and poked and prodded the eyes umpteen times, they're a little haggard, so I'll touch up the pupils with a couple dabs of black before moving on to adding some shading. I'll start by giving the entire body a heavy blue-gray wash to break up the monotony of the white. Now, once it had dried, I immediately regretted doing it, but because there's no way that I can get the wash off without messing up all the eyeballs, I'm just gonna have to lean into it. You can tell I was panicking at this point, since despite applying dozens of coats of white to bring back the brightness, I barely have any footage, and what I do have is kinda blurry and off-center. However, after adding some bone white highlights, I decided to move on to gooping up the eyeballs, which I did by applying several coats of high gloss varnish. Then once the varnish had had a chance to dry thoroughly, I applied a thin watery red wash into the cracks and edges of the eyes to help them stand out a bit more. Now, because of the smooth, non-absorbent nature of the gloss varnish, the watery wash flowed easily into the edges, leaving the eyeball mostly clear. And once again, I repeated these steps for the other two rings, and it was time to add the finishing details to the big central eye. I thought the red rim of the little ring eyes looked really smart, and I wanted to recreate this for the larger eye, so I started by sponging a couple layers of red onto the back of the eyeball, creating a messy gradient working my way out. Then, using my finest fine lining brush, I drew lots of little veins leading from the goopy red bit at the back of the eye out towards the center of the eyeball. Finally, a bit more fine lining to create some more veiny bits leading away from the iris, and I'm ready to coat my eyeball in a couple layers of high gloss varnish. With that, my O-Phantom is O-finished, and all I need to do is attach the pieces. I ended up filling those pre-poked magnet holes with some more eyeballs, since about halfway through I decided to just use pins to hold everything in place. Because I use Cosclay, and Cosclay has a rubbery finish when baked, it's easy enough to press the pins through the baked ring bodies without breaking or cracking the clay. Once I've got the pins in place, I can clip the tips off, and I'm left with a barely visible pivot point. Then it's just a case of fitting the second ring onto the first and pinning it in place before doing the same thing to the final outer ring. By pinning the rings 90 degrees offset to the subsequent ring, I can press the rings out to create that final O-Phantom shape. Last but not least, so I can hang my biblically accurate angel on my tree, I'll attach a little invisible fishing line. Of course, I don't have a Christmas tree, so instead I'll drill a hole in the bottom to fit a little acrylic rod so that I can at least have it floating for the Glamour Shots. Speaking of which, guess we're on to the Glamour Shots.
Be not afraid.
As always, a huge thank you to the absolute gems over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to my newest patrons, Jupiter and Mel, That One Joey, Erica with a K, Meg the Children Eating Witch, Martin Gobauer, Rachel Elizabeth, Kat A. Turna, The Weird Maldonna Dudes, Shub, Chelsea, The Bullfrog People, Hannah Collette, Danielle Lutke, Venomous Bite, Sam and Hamish who love tiny wormy dealies, Clumsy AF, and Jeff. You are the angelic spinning ocular rings that somehow keep this channel aloft. Merry Christmas, everyone, or if you celebrate a different holiday, then happy holidays to whatever that may be. Or if you don't celebrate anything at all, then happy Friday, I guess. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.